afternoon to this august gathering present here. Welcome to the 10th edition of the Apeejay Calcutta Literary Festival. Truth be told, ladies and gentlemen, I'm a little too glad to see people turning up and braving a cold winter Sunday afternoon. And thanks to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, that we get to share the belief that great cities are built not just with roads, buildings, and skyscrapers, but on the collective intellect of the populace. It is again because of you, ladies and gentlemen, that we get to believe that robust and liberal societies need such dynamic platforms to continue exchanging such great conversations and nuanced thinking. Precisely why, ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here to have two very distinguished personalities with us. One of them is Mr. Rohan Murthy. He's a computer scientist and an entrepreneur. He's also the founder of the Murthy Classical Library of India back in 2010. And then, of course, we have a moderator, Mr. Arunava Sinha, and we're just glad that he's back at Calcutta because on day one, he couldn't really come for our event since his flight was delayed. Mr. Arunava Sinha is a translator of Bengali literature. He's a recipient of the Crossword Translation Award for his English translation of Shankar's Chorungi in 2007 and Anita Agnihotri's 17 in 2011. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I leave it to these two gentlemen to enthrall us with their conversations. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Has everyone had breakfast, lunch, brunch? Because we'll be happy if you order and eat and have your coffee through the conversation. It'll make us hungry and interested. Hi Rohan, good to have you in Kolkata.
Hi Arunava, thank you.
And for those who don't know, Rohan lives between three cities, if lives is the right word. Bangalore, Boston, and this is not a Jhumpa Lahiri book. Bangalore, Boston and London. And is sometimes not aware of exactly where he is. So just to let you know, you're in Kolkata.
Thank you. Yes.
And you're in this really beautiful, wonderful space for a conversation with the smell of baking. It's lovely, really. So, you know, what Rohan is a computer scientist. Rohan has very illustrious parents whom I will not mention or try not to mention in the course of this conversation.
Thank you.
So we'll leave it to your guess work in case you don't know. But he is a computer scientist. He has a PhD in computer science, right? And he also has almost a PhD in philosophy.
Masters.
A master. Yeah, that's what I meant. I mean, he's just going to do it at some point. And it was in the process, perhaps, of his studying these two disciplines that he had this fantastic vision of ensuring that the classic literatures of India, and when I say classic literatures, I really mean literatures that go back thousands of years and have been written in various Indian languages, get a global and an Indian readership in modern English translations. It's an extraordinary vision, the Murthy Classical Library, which is helmed from Harvard University.
Harvard University Press.
Harvard University Press, with Sheldon Pollock being the series editor?
The general editor.
The general editor, yeah. And perhaps what struck me as the most extraordinary thing about Rohan's vision behind this is that he sees it as going on for 100 years at least, which means that it's a project which will outlive the person who thought of it, which will outlive the first set of people who started on it, and really involve two generations, including perhaps a generation that has not yet been born. And it really requires some extraordinary thinking to be able to think along those lines. So I know you may have told this story before, but still tell us again how this whole thing began in your head.
Sure. So, when I was a PhD student and I was studying computer science, I became very interested in philosophy, and you know that's a separate sort of longer story. But and I started studying philosophy quite seriously. And some of the texts that I started studying, and you know, I was taking graduate classes, were texts where they were one-off translations of you know 3rd, 4th, 5th century Sanskrit philosophy texts. And I was very intrigued as to why are people translating these texts. And in fact, without these translations, people like myself could not access this information. And so one thing led to another. And along the way, I was introduced to, there's an old effort called as the Loeb Classical Library, which now for 105 years has been translating Greek and Latin texts to English. And I didn't know of the Low Classical Library. I'm a computer scientist. I grew up in India. And I was fascinated. And the vision of the Low Classical Library was to get more people to read Greek and Latin texts. In fact, if you look at the size of the Low Classical Library books, they're quite small. And the idea that Mr. Loeb had back in time was that it would fit into a gentleman's coat pocket, and every gentleman should carry these books around. And they've retained that form factor. And so then I sort of became very intrigued, and eventually we got to a point where I found myself asking, why do we not have something like this for Indian texts, for lack of a better term? Sort of, when I say Indian, it encompasses a huge region. And so that's pretty much how we got started. And of course, when you start saying Indian text, people immediately think of Sanskrit, which of course is the mother language. But then there are also regional languages. There's my mother tongue. The classical form of my mother tongue is Old Kannada, which is quite different from contemporary Kannada, or Hale Kannada as we say in Kannada. There's Old Tamil, medieval Bangla, medieval Marathi, medieval Telugu, Malayalam, Pali, the language in which Buddhism spread, and so on. So there are many languages we found we could bring under the umbrella, and so eventually that's how we got started, with being inspired by the vision of the Loeb Library, saying, why can't we also translate these extraordinary Indian classics and make them accessible to the general public? And the vision is to do it for a long period of time. And as far as I know, we are the largest and most complex translation effort anywhere today. 14 classical Indian languages that we cover.
So now you're what, about 20 books strong?
21.
21, great. So talk us through the process, from the time that it was an idea in your head to the time the first book came out, the first set of books came out. What were the steps that you took? How did you find the right people, etc.?
Sure. So the very first thing that we had to do was to assemble a board of editors, folks who, in some sense, spanned these languages, or at least a subset of these languages, were experts in these languages. Through various friends and so on, I was introduced to Shelley Pollock, who, of course, as a Sanskritist and as an academic scholar, is very well respected for Sanskrit. And then, of course, he has many contacts in the field, and there are other great scholars. So, as an example, we have David Shulman. So, if you're studying anything to do with Telugu and Malayalam, anywhere in the world, people will acknowledge and tell you should go to Hebrew University and meet David Shulman, who's an extraordinary scholar for these two languages. And so like this, we found a couple more of scholars. We formed the board of editors. Then we set up the endowment. And then we set up a board of trustees as well. Because the idea is, how do you build an institution that will survive over long periods of time? And these are the more sort of hygiene things to do. And the harder things then is filling up a pipeline of texts for the purposes of translation. And here we took two approaches. One approach was, we got all the editors to call all their friends, whoever they knew, saying, hey, we are doing this effort. Would you like to sign up to translate? Or we knew of people who were going to embark on a translation sort of effort of their own. So we called them up and said, why don't you do it for us? And second, we started soliciting proposals as well. And then in the meantime, we needed a design, a branding, a logo, and all of these things. So I proposed saying, instead of going to some expensive firm, why don't we get the public to take part in helping us design the look of our series? If any of you have seen, if you go to our website, murthylibrary.com, or you've seen our books, the design actually has an interesting story. So we turned it into a competition, and we said the winner will get a monetary prize, but more importantly, every book that we publish that uses the winner's design will credit them on the cover. And so if we do survive 100 years, the winner's name will be around for 100 years. And so we got 156 entries. We anonymized all the entries, and we created a panel and sub-selected, and eventually brought it down to 10 entries, and we picked one. And then when we unmasked the winner, we found the winner was actually a designer in San Francisco named Andrea Stranger. And she'd done an extraordinary effort. And so then, we got the look and everything else. And then on the press side, Harvard University press side, because they've had this machinery for doing Greek and Latin translations and the copy editing to everything else and so on, they sort of, it was about replicating a lot of that. But in our case, we have a lot more diversity as well. So gearing up for that. So all of this took, I would say, about 4 to 5 years. And so finally, our first set of books came out in 2014 January. So every January, we release new volumes, 4 to 5 new volumes. And so that's really how we got started. And now we have a pipeline that's filled for the next several years. In fact, we have the reverse problem now. We have a problem where people are saying, look, if I sign up, I mean, these are scholars who've been studying these languages forever. And they're saying, look, if I sign up to translate something for you, it'll only come out in 20 years from now. And that's kind of too far. And we are saying, yes, but you don't have an alternative. So,
yeah, but they're saying they might be dead by then.
You're
not saying it, I am.
Some of them are quite distinguished.
Not young people, yeah. Well, yeah. But so were you, was it an obvious choice that it would have to be in Harvard? Did you think of locating this whole thing in India?
Yes and no. So the few sort of contacts that I had in India, I would say, broadly speaking, in this area of study, I spoke to various people. The challenge for me was, if we do indeed want, look, I had a choice, for example, to run this as an independent, not-for-profit foundation. But then I would have to devote my life to running this, and this is not my main job. And the idea is really, my main concern was longevity. How does this survive for at least actually not just 100 years, hopefully even longer? And so I needed to find a vehicle where I would have confidence of the institution surviving. And the only institutions that I know on the planet that survive over long periods of time are universities. And so one option was to go to Oxford University Press for this reason. The other was to stay at Harvard. And so that really was the primary determinant for me about longevity and an institutional mechanism. And so I picked Harvard because anyway, I had contacts there, I knew people there, and they've already anyway done this translation kind of stuff. They've run a couple of these kinds of series and libraries. In fact, I would say that the CEO, if you will, of this classical library project is a person named Sharmila Sen, who's at Harvard University Press. She used to be a professor of English at Harvard, and then she moved to the press. And she's extraordinary. In fact, she's probably the single biggest reason. It's not Sheldon Pollock. She's the single biggest reason why the series still runs. And so I knew her, and I had very high confidence that she'll be able to pull this off. And so that's why we really started there.
And there really isn't a similar institution in India, one has to be honest about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, and it can be built. It's just, in my case, I knew then I would have to make this my life's mission. Yeah. I should not do anything else, which I think, I'm a technical person. I want to do technical work. So that's the reason why I chose.
Okay, so now look me in the eye and tell me how many of the 21 books you've read.
No, I'll be honest. I've read about 14.
That's amazing. I mean, only Sharmila has read more, I'm sure.
If at all. So.
Yeah, if at all. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And what do you feel, as a reader, tell us how Rohan feels after having read those 14 books. Because that's why people will read.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have so many things to say about this, Arunava. One is, even before you get to the reading, when people come to my house now, I have 21 volumes. And that in itself makes me look a little bit smarter. And actually...
I don't think you suffer from that problem.
No, but
as far as image is concerned.
No, in the sense of, oh wow, this man really knows about many things, whether I have read them or not. Right? So I would encourage people, if for nothing else, at least, we are a non-profit, not that we make money off of this, just for sake of awareness, buy these books, adorn your bookshelves with them, you will look very intelligent, as a first thing. Because Sharmila was telling me, the Loeb Library, which has now about, in 105 years, they've done 500 something volumes. People go to the bookstore and buy the Loeb books by the meters. They buy them by the meters. My question was, do they read them? Shelves? Yeah, no, you put them at home, you look really intelligent.
I have a 3-meter shelf, so give me 3 meters worth of...
Yeah, 3 meters worth of Loebs, and suddenly you look very well learned. And so I would, of course, I would want people to read, but I'm saying you can even start from there. the next thing about these books is, if you actually, even if you don't read them, if you read the introduction to the books, that I think that in itself has value. Of course, we'd love for you to read the actual books because there's a lot of great content and depth. And people who have done these translations are not people who are doing it part-time for fun. You know, these are very high bar scholarly translations. But we've asked all our translators to write a very detailed and thorough introduction for each one of the texts to explain the context, to explain the timelines, and the relevance, and so on. And that in itself, I think, has a lot of value. And then, of course, you have the actual content, which I am biased, but I believe is fantastic. And so this is sort of this multi-layered approach to these books.
Yeah, but what did they do for you when you read them?
So the thing that strikes me at a first level is just the extraordinary diversity. I'll give you some stats. Out of the 21 books, I think we have covered 9 languages so far. We have published the oldest, at least the oldest poetry written by women anywhere that is still accessible to mankind. I believe we have published that book.
Yeah, that was a huge revelation for me.
The Therigatha.
Buddhist poetry by Buddhist women.
Right.
Yeah.
It was written roughly in 200 BC by the first set of women, Buddhist nuns, and the stories of how they became nuns. It's in Pali and in Burmese script. When you say Pali and Burmese script, I don't know how many scholars are left who can really read the whole thing. So that's just one end of the spectrum. Then we have done we're plowing through the entire Akbarnama. We're plowing through Tulsi Das's Ramcharitmanas. Last year we published the cornerstone of Sindhi poetry, Risalo, which in my opinion is the best that we have done so far. We have...
Why do you say that? What makes it?
Oh, it's just beautiful. And I didn't know anything about Risalo before I read this. I had no cultural context for any of the material and so on. Then we have done, we have done 13th century Kannada text, medieval Kannada text, Raghavanka's Harishchandra, story of King Harishchandra, etc., etc., etc. So it's this incredible diversity that, to me, makes me feeling very proud and very happy, because I feel, Western civilization is so proud of the tenuous connections to Greek and Latin. Heck, I mean, we have, we have 14 here, and 14 is not even the real number, by the way. 14 is a subset, but even that is extraordinary to see the sort of the breadth and depth of the kinds of texts. We have done poetries, there are plays, there are court documents. When you read the Akbarnama, really, a lot of it is the court documents as well. And so again, even in terms of content, the diversity really strikes me. Yeah. But when I read specific books, like, here's the best thing about reading Therigatha. If you watch Back to the Future and time travel, this book is time travel. Because when you read this book, and I think, Arunava, you may have read the book, yeah? No, I haven't. Okay, I really encourage many people to read it. And by the way, it's not an easy read, because it's about the difficulties of the lives of many of these women, and, like a woman talks of how a child died unnaturally, and therefore, out of grief and sorrow, she became a Buddhist nun. And that's hard to read. But you read about what life was like, what thoughts were like, what was accepted socially or not in 200 BC, and how women were speaking very openly about it. I would perhaps hazard a guess as it is maybe harder to say those things today. Yeah, no, by the way, I'm not talking political climate and so on. I just mean as a society than 200 BC, which actually, by the way, I would not have guessed. So it's this incredible sort of time-traveling opportunity.
Right. And I've dipped into it, if not read the whole thing. And this whole talk of being forced out of a life of desire, which is very real, and it's not at all in the realm of philosophizing in that sense. And from Bangla, you've done Monasha Mongol, is that right? Is that the one?
Sorry, maybe I don't. No, we have done.
Which one? Another Mongol.
Yes,
right,
sorry.
Right,
I may not be able to say it with the right accent, but
thanks.
that's right.
Another Mongol.
Yes, another Mongol. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, what happens? What is your involvement now with whole?
Minimal. Because we now have a board of trustees, board of editors, we have an endowment, the press is publishing books, we have a pipeline of books. So now I'm more or less a reader, and once in a while I touch base, but I'm not as deeply involved.
But what's the reactions been like from the world and from India? Can you talk about them separately?
I think many of you here have read in the papers some of the unfortunate reactions in India.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's leave that out because
Okay.
that was clearly not a literary question but a political
Sure,
one.
sure.
But I'm interested in the literary and philosophical responses.
Yeah. So we've had, in that sense, Arunava, we've had very strong, favorable response. My argument with one of my colleagues, who is a senior faculty member, the classics department at Harvard used to be, when you say classics, you only mean Greek and Latin. And you know, Harvard, for example, has this core curriculum. No matter if you're a mathematician or a historian or whatever it is, as an undergrad, you study the core curriculum. So I'd say to him, look, in the core, you're teaching people a narrow view or a narrow definition of classics, of Greek and Latin. Why is my mother tongue, which is, 1500 or so years old, why is that not a classic? So he'd say to me, hey, you produce some books we can use, and yeah, sure, it's a classic. We'll have our kids read them. So now Harvard has introduced a bunch of these books into its curriculum. And it's not alone. Many US universities, I know Columbia, the reason I know is I'm getting emails from faculty who are doing this. Berkeley, Stanford, Yale, many other places, which is nice. So that means that it is now becoming part of some sort of an academic, it's becoming part of the fabric that students go through, which is wonderful. And of course, you have graduate students who are using them as well. We find that, in fact, there are, a reasonable fraction of the books are bought by people outside of academia in the United States and United Kingdom, which is really nice to know. Maybe they're buying by the few meters right now, but that's still okay. And so the reaction that way has been very positive. In India, I don't yet know of a systematic way in which people are utilizing these books. I occasionally will get an email from a faculty member here or there saying, I'm using these books. I've heard from faculty at DU, from Ashoka, from JNU. But really, my dream for what this should be in India is that this should be a serious option in the syllabi for Indian schools. Because, so you were saying you went to Don Bosco, right? That's ICSE?
Yeah.
Okay, so things have not changed, which is, if you're in ICSE, you're reading Shakespeare, you're reading Charles Dickens, you're reading Walt Whitman's, in my time, we read Walt Whitman's Oh Captain, My Captain.
Yeah.
Right?
And people probably still read it.
Okay, and the truth is, my friends and I had no idea who, well, okay, at home I'd heard of Abraham Lincoln, but we had no idea what a civil war was. Because we have not had a civil war of that kind in India. Or we read James Joyce's Ulysses, and we used to speak to each other in Kannada in school and say, man, these Greek people, who are these guys? Are they really bloody? Because we didn't understand anything, and we kept calling it Ithaca. That's how strange it was, and the whole context. And yet we accepted it, and we read it, and we were tested on it. Our teachers didn't know much about it. We didn't know much about it. It was very strange. But we never read a single Indian classic, not one. And after 60, 70, whatever, how many years of independence, 71 now, 71 years of independence, we have no excuse for not reading our own texts. It seems like a deeply self-inflicted wound. So to me, the biggest impact we ideally ought to have is in India, where at least in the kind of, now I don't know, maybe in Madhyamik and so on, in Bengal, maybe it's more balanced. But certainly in the central syllabi, it's not balanced at all.
No, it's not anywhere. So my
Yeah.
question is, are you doing something to sort of evangelize, or are you waiting for people to take the initiative?
Well, the whole purpose of evangelizing is why I'm here,
Yeah,
and so on, right? And I admit, forums like this, while good, are not enough. And so I go to various forums, I try. But I think to have a systemic impact, I need to be able to convince the powers that be that run syllabi that they should use these kinds of texts as options, which have thus far not yet been successful at doing.
Maybe an anthology of excerpts might be a good entry point.
Perhaps, but for example, at Jaipur last year, a parent asked me saying, oh, my kid doesn't find these texts interesting, can you produce simpler versions or abridged versions? But actually I have very strong views against that, because we never read abridged Shakespeare. we read Shakespeare in all its glory and gory details, and to the extent where a lot of it didn't make any sense.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's the bar to be held to, but here we actually have a cultural context for us to read these texts. So I would love for any, like, for example, Harish Chandra, right? I mean, Harish Chandra is an important figure in Indian history. I mean, Mahatma Gandhi is one of his heroes, or Harish Chandra. Why do we not use Harish Chandra as one possible text in its full detail?
Yeah.
And
So you're influential in Karnataka, if I may say so. You should try.
I've thus far not yet been
But
successful.
you have to make a start somewhere. One book.
No, I'll tell you,
one curriculum.
to be honest, I mean, it's two things. One is I've not tried very hard because I need to make time. Otherwise, it will not happen. The second is also, this is a subset of the population. This is not necessarily the norm. Sometimes people get too sensitive saying, why aren't there if there are not enough Indians doing this translation, then this is some insult to my culture, and therefore I'm very wary, I don't read the book.
Yeah, no, we've heard that. And that was the primary attack against Sheldon Pollock.
Yeah.
Which was deplorable because he was a man who was actually helming the whole thing. People won't do it themselves, but they will.
Yeah. So I think to overcome this kind of thought, there has to be a lot more outreach, a lot more explanation, a lot more of engagement, which I hope to do the next coming years. So, I mean, it's wonderful that people abroad are reading them, and I think that is important. But I think ultimately we need to get our own kids here to read.
That's the whole point. I think more people are reading them abroad and finding out more about the history of India's cultures than people here are.
Yeah. Oh, in fact, what will be very surprising is you'll find undergraduate students from Ivies knowing about King Harish Chandra or learning about Risalo, and there'll be kids in India who will have no idea what these words mean. That's kind of very sad.
Yeah. And also, perhaps, I mean, you don't have to say yes or no to this, but perhaps actually reading these classics is at odds with creating this manufactured version of the past. That's the rage now. I have a feeling that,
Yeah, but the truth is every society has always had this strain. You have, people who believe and claim strange things in the US and other societies too. That doesn't bother me as much. It has never bothered me. As opposed to all of that, I would really like people to actually read what is true and what is real. And where you don't have to debate science or fact or fiction.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? It's literature. It was there.
So what's the time? I mean, where do the classics stop in your scheme of things?
But see, that is a very good question. There's no clear definition. It really varies. We have had texts from as recent as the 18th century, and we've had texts that go as far as 200 BC. So I don't think there has been a real kind of clear definition of classic. To be honest, I think it is left largely to the discretion of the editorial board, where it should feel like a classic, whatever that means. So yeah, there's no clear answer for what is or what is not a classic. But, perhaps if somebody wrote a 20th century novel, maybe that's not yet a classic. I would say it doesn't feel like a classic,
Sure. So which is thanks for that cue, because my next question is whether you've thought of a Murthy modern library.
Actually, no, I've not. And that's not a bad idea. The reason I've not is, let's do some very simple mathematics. So 14 languages, we'll for a moment take Sanskrit out, 13 languages. Let's assume, just for the sake of simplification and being very generous, or rather being very conservative, each language has 10 million texts, okay, in the classical forms. And this means that 10 million old Kannada texts, which are quite different, old Kannada to medieval Kannada texts, from contemporary Kannada. I can read and write and speak contemporary Kannada, but the old forms are quite different. So it's 10 million times 13. Each language has 10 million, let's say, 130 million. Now you take Sanskrit. Now Sanskrit, of course, is the mother lode. So I have no idea how to even estimate, but just for sake of discussion, assume 100 million texts in Sanskrit. Okay. Now that's about approximately 200 million texts of classical literature. Now, that is your denominator. That is your universe of what needs to be preserved and so on. If our series were to survive for 100 years, I think at best we would have done between about 500 to 600 volumes. Let's even be more generous to us and say we would have done 1,000 volumes, so we would have doubled our output. Because we do about 4 to 5 volumes a year, so 100 years is 500 volumes. Let's even say, fine, we do 1,000. We would have done 1,000 volumes out of 200 million. Which means that we are not even a rounding off error. It means that we have barely even made a dent.
Sure.
So this series in the long term, ironically, is also inconsequential. And the point that I'm trying to make is the classical forms, in my opinion, are under the biggest threat today. Or have been under threat for some time. And the rate of threat only increases. Because, you know, I'm a perfect example, South Indian glasses, study computer science, right? And I'm not unique that way, I'm very common. And in my social circle and friend circle, I know no one who can read the old form of my mother tongue. And so now what happens to these 10 million books? So our attempt in our own small way is, can we rescue as many as we can? And so that's why, to me, the focus on the classics is so much more urgent and necessary. And so really, it's not just one MCLI. You need 10,000 or 100,000 MCLIs to flourish, and larger efforts to make some reasonable dent to rescuing the classics. So that's why, to me, I prioritize the classics over the contemporary, because I still think contemporary, you know, you're translating and other people are translating, and somehow maybe we'll keep it alive. But the classics, I think they're in a lot more trouble, and they're already in trouble. And here's the fundamental truth. We're already there's a tsunami of cultural loss that we are in the middle of. Because look at the math, right? I mean, if you assume, even if I may be off by a factor of 10, it's the loss is still
Sure,
terrible.
absolutely. Yeah. You know, mathematically, yes. But I'm not so sure that's the only way to look at it. Because, you know, there are great works and so on.
No, but even
They're
then,
not of uniform
but
quality
even then,
standard.
fine. You can even assume 1% of these texts are great works. 1% of 200 million is 2 million.
Yeah.
But we are only doing 1,000.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, this is why I find this very stressful, which is, even in 100 years from now, these things should not become so alien to us. Because this is an accumulation of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, or whatever, how many ever thousands of years of culture. And that is at stake. And is already we are losing.
Yeah. Have you had any thoughts about translating them in between the other Indian languages?
You know, if we could, that would be great. We would do it. I'll tell you actually what one of our challenges is. Even doing these translations itself is difficult for us. So, you take old Kannada. I mean, by the way, there are many generations of extraordinary old Kannada scholars. But, you know, that generation is been receding. And so now the challenge for us is to find a translator who understands old Kannada very well, which you can find, by the way, but then also is able to translate it to, for example, English in our case. The challenge there is we can't find both sides easily. If you look very, very hard, maybe you'll find one or two. So what do? We say, okay, let's go old Kannada to Kannada, at least. But when you do that, you have, every translation you have some loss. No translation is lossless. I'm sure you can appreciate that, right? Then we go from Kannada to English, you have another hop, so you have another set, you have another loss. So to us, being able to get it to one language itself is a big sort of challenge. Now to be able to go to other languages, imagine you want to go from old Kannada to contemporary Tamil. I think that's nearly impossible in my mind.
Fair enough, but I like the idea of at least old Kannada to modern Kannada, old Tamil to modern Tamil.
Yeah, you're
and
right.
so on.
You're right. And something for us to consider.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but yeah.
So we're not getting funding for a modern Murthy library.
No, I'm not saying no to that. In fact, the way to make that argument is like this.
Yes, you tell me how to make that
The way
argument.
to make that argument is, if you don't start working on that problem now, in 100 years from now, you'll be
That's right.
lamenting
Correct.
that, oh, if only 100 years ago I listened to Arunava, we would not have had this kind of loss.
That's right.
You know, because today's contemporary will be tomorrow's classics.
Yeah, and frankly, there are not 200 million texts to translate today, fortunately.
Excellent. So
Numerically, it's a tractable problem.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
By the way, but there's one other
Yes.
thing, the reason, because we had a lot of, I had a lot of sort of opinions and thoughts of why to English and so on. The reason to English, to a certain extent, is growing up in Bangalore, I would never, I can't read or write Hindi. And I'm not, again, nothing unique about that trait. It's quite common. Because our mother tongue, we learn Kannada or whatever, Tamil and this and that. Or if you grow up in Delhi, highly unlikely you will learn Kannada as your, in school, right?
Yeah.
Or you grow up in Calcutta, you learn Kannada, any which way. So having some sort of a common medium that everybody around the country can read in, and Hindi is one of them, but English is also one of them. And with English, you also access an international audience. So that's how we ended up.
Yeah, no, I think that's almost a given that it would have to be English.
Oh, because you can imagine sometimes I get grief.
Unless you chose Chinese, of course.
Yeah,
because that is the real way to topple the Chinese civilization,
that's right. That's right.
All right, I'm going to open this up for questions now. I have plenty more, but yeah, great. There are questions. Do we have a mic for questions from the audience, please? Or you can take mine.
He looks like a young man. He can shout.
Maybe the others.
Oh, that's true.
Accessible to younger people, and we have already had translations of these. So how about consolidating all these already translated works of previous classics and short stories, so that it is more accessible and also like a starting point for younger people too?
You're talking of, for example, Jatka tales, or you're saying taking these current...
Jataka tales and the like consolidating translations
No, you're
which
right.
are already existing.
I'll tell you the honest truth. Is this going online? Well, I don't care, frankly. I'll tell you the honest truth as to why. That's actually a very good idea. It's because we still do rely on these scholars and academics who are very good at what they do. In fact, they're very high caliber at what they do. But the flip side of working with academics and scholars is they also have a very narrow and limited definition of what they consider to be great text. So, not to say that they won't appreciate Jatka tales, but if you put a Harishchandra next to Jatka tales, they say, I'll do the Harishchandra. And so, I think there's this kind of bias in all the scholars and the translators. And by the way, it has nothing to do with India, US, and so on. This is generally how academics everywhere behave. If they think that there's a more purist form of a text that they can translate, they want to do that. But you're right. There's a case to be made for doing something a lot more broad and a lot more mainstream and accessible. And I shall take that under advisement.
Hi. I just graduated from Vassar College, which is a liberal arts college, and I was doing post-colonial studies, not in the terms of...
I'm really sorry to hear about that.
Yeah, I know. So my professor, when we were talking about him, I also come from a business family from Calcutta. And so he sort of held you up as an example of something that you can do while you come from a business family, but you don't have to sort of be narrowed in to that line. My question basically is that this is basically knowledge production, right? So what we were dealing with post-colonial studies is not the politics of it, but the knowledge part of it. And what this library in some sense tries to do is sort of recover that knowledge and make it more accessible. So do you see some sort of like allied movements in India that are going on that sort of complement your work in terms of you touched on it a little bit during your remarks, but do you see some other allied movements that you see are encouraging or signs of optimism in that sense? And the other part of my question is, like, as a child, I was a big fan of the Amar Chitra Kathas. So for me, those made these stories accessible as in part of my imagination.
Sorry, I have my memory is like a sieve. The longer you speak, the less I forget what
sorry,
you asked.
that was the end of my
So
two
just give me in
questions.
one tweet. What is your question? Sorry, others I will not remember.
Sure. My first question is, do you see any sort of complementary movements, institutions, things going on in India in relation to the library, the kind of work that the library is trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, we are by no means unique. There are many, there are many good scholars here who are doing, there are, for example, there are scholars of, there are historians of science who are rediscovering and digging up and translating and writing expositions, for example, on how Madhava School of Mathematics in Kerala actually discovered the beginnings of calculus, or maybe even, I've not read it to the fullest extent to make a comprehensive statement, but certainly the forms of calculus well before Newton and Leibniz in Kerala, which is extraordinary. So there are people, there are scholars who are doing some work like this. But again, we need more and more and more people like this. But I just, want to say something about the post-colonial thing. I actually think there's far too much, I have a very strong view on this, far too much of study of this colonial, post-colonial, subaltern, and all of this kind of stuff that Spivak and many of these other people have done. I'm not taking away anything from their academic merits. The problem with these kinds of things is, if you go to a history of science department anywhere, in any Western university as an example, you'll see that they'll all talk of Plato and Aristotle and some Greek text, some Latin text, and so on. The conversation about any Indian intellectual history is zero. And my friends who are faculty members who are training the next generation of scholars are all doing colonial, post-colonial, and this and that, and so on. And so I keep wondering then, where in 100 years, or not 500, in 30 years from now, where are the next generation of scholars who can actually do a lot of this work? I don't know where they're being trained.
I agree, which is why I came back, and yeah.
Yeah. So I think we need more focus on Indian intellectual history. Even if you go back to what we studied in school in our history syllabus, bust of the bearded man in Indus Valley civilization, and then a few random trinkets of dates. Okay, Ashoka was a nice king, and then there's this bloody war and this and that. Then Mughal period, then revolt of 1857. From then on, it expands dramatically. But actually, by doing that, we have skipped some 3,000-4,000 of years of like extraordinary detailed history that I think we're missing. It's not being studied.
It needn't be either or, of course. Both need to be done, perhaps.
Yeah, but I think we've had too much of the latter, and almost nothing of the former.
Or not enough that trickles down to people at large.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a quote by, I forget who. Somebody said, India's the one place where you don't need to invent history. You have to just read it. But for that, somebody has to do that scholarly work.
Well, maybe that's a project worth taking.
Yeah. Please.
Yes.
That's a very good question. The question was, in what form are these, let's say, I throw out a very, very approximate number, 200 million manuscripts. Are they in dusty libraries? Have they been digitized? The answer is it's probably everything. There's some very small subset that are digitized. But I think, and I know there are digitization efforts that are taking place in Delhi, in Hyderabad, in Carnegie Mellon, actually. In fact, the only Indian to have won the equivalent of the Nobel in computer science, the Turing Award, is a professor named Raj Reddy at Carnegie Mellon, a very well-known computer scientist. He has devoted his last 20 years of his research to only digitizing Indian manuscripts, including things on like palm leaves and so on. So I know, he's working with many agencies in India as well. I know there's work like this happening in the UK, in the US, and different parts of India. But I don't have a sense of where all of them are sitting. In fact, to me, part of it is preserving these texts, these manuscripts, but there's a second part, which is, even if you preserve them, who can read them? I worry more about the latter than the former, because I think inevitably we'll figure out ways and we will preserve them, or at least we'll preserve a subset of them that's quite large. But if nobody can read them, then what's the point? They'll become like nice patterns for clothing and, things like that. So.
Yes. Can we have the mic, please? Someone has a question, is asking already.
Thank you. Hello? Yeah. So this is the project that I think about next, in the very early stages of doing, which is, India's had, among other things, there's one extraordinary intellectual contribution. I don't know of another system or civilization where where poetry was the lingua franca for expressing mathematics. This is, and when I say this, right, this is not some afterthought, okay, somebody wrote a poem and said, oh, look, there's some cute little facts about it. No. 2,000 years ago, there was, if there's no such thing as I'm a mathematician, you're a poet. The two are the same. So, as an example, so I have a very close friend named Manjul Bhargava, who perhaps many of you know of or may know. Manjul is the first Indian origin person to win the Fields Medal, which is the highest honor in mathematics. He won it in 2014. He's a professor of mathematics at Princeton. So, and by the way, what Manjul is saying is not unique. Many mathematicians in India have said the same thing. So he gives an example of a poem from, I think, which was earlier on believed from 10th century. We have now figured out actually it's not 10th century, it's from 7th century. And the poem is about the following. For those of you who know Sanskrit, in Sanskrit you have two kinds of syllables, Laghu and Guru, long and short. The length of a long syllable is exactly twice the length of a short syllable. And by the way, there are very good biological reasons why Sanskrit is designed this way. And so there was a poet named Virahanka who was asking the following question. He asked, if I'm trying to construct a stanza with n syllables, how many ways can I combine long and short so I have n syllables in a stanza? And he posed this problem as a poem. Okay? And then he gave the solution to the problem in another stanza. That's also a poem. And then he gave a proof to that in a one-line kind of haiku style poem. And it turns out, when you actually understand what he said, you basically reproduce what we have all in our education learnt as the Fibonacci sequence. But this was done about 300-400 years prior to Fibonacci. And it was derived out of the movement of syllables in Sanskrit poetry. Now, the reason this is extraordinary on many levels is that first, if you look at most flowers in nature, the number of petals that you'll find is always a Fibonacci number. But that there should be a connection between the number of petals in a flower and number of syllables in Sanskrit is truly extraordinary. That means whoever thought of this thing a long time ago of Sanskrit really had probably figured out these connections or had figured out the importance of this kind of underlying structure. And now the second very impressive thing about this kind of thought is that all of these ideas are expressed in poetry form. And not just that, in fact, if you see, I think about roughly 2,000 years ago, or maybe 1800 years ago, I don't remember the exact dates, Aryabhatta gave a poem, and the poem is about the journey of a little bee as it goes from one flower to another flower. My mother tells me she went to Kannada medium school, and this is how she first learned mathematics, through this poem, but in Kannada, in Sanskrit. When you read this poem, it's the journey of a bee from one flower to another flower, it meets another bee along the way, and so on. And finally, the poem ends with something like, the translation roughly is something like, so now, O fair maiden, tell me how many bees there were, or something like that. So it turns out the solution to this poem is another poem, which is the world's first expressed quadratic equation. Right? So there are these extraordinarily deep connections between mathematics and poetry that I don't know of another civilization where they express mathematics through poetry. And the reason this is so important is that it's very strange, right? For many of us in school, the way we learn mathematics, by the way, it's quite dull, it's quite dry. Of course, it works for some subset of people who go on to become extraordinary mathematicians. But it feels very inaccessible. And second, we create these artificial categories and boundaries of humanities and mathematics. And I know so many people who say, oh, I'm an English major, but I am not very good at mathematics. Well, 2,000 years ago, you wouldn't have made that statement. It turns out that if you're a poet, you would have also, without knowing, or maybe you knew, you were a good mathematician. And so this is really, really important, I think. because I think the opportunity is to rewrite the way at least schools do mathematics education. I truly believe that up to a certain standard in schools, we can now introduce mathematics through poetry as the default norm. I'm not saying you can learn all of mathematics this way and everybody will become a great mathematician. No, that's not what I'm saying. But I certainly think you can make mathematics far more amenable to young children up to a certain age, and not just in India, anywhere in the world. And this is, as far as I know, I don't have any other civilization that has done this. And it's extraordinary. And it's just one example that I gave you. The more and more you read, by the way, you will find, the world's first, until Panini, who invented modern grammar in 500 BC roughly, people did not know that you can study grammar as a science. And so for those of you who study or will study or have studied computer science, any notion of a computer language, is based on what is called as a context-free grammar. The world's first context-free grammar was created by Panini. And if you go back and see how he constructed context-free grammar when he sort of wrote the rules of Sanskrit in 500 BC, it remarkably resembles how we think of computer languages. Now, of course, I'm not going to claim, like people have, that, okay, we invented computer science 500 BC. That's not what I'm saying. But again, there are these extraordinary connections between Sanskrit, between poetry, all of these forms of expression, and a lot of what we think about today. I don't want to say all of mathematics. I mean, there's a deeper question. Oh, absolutely. At least the ancients figured it out. Yeah. So if you also see how Madhva school in Kerala did mathematics and so on, there used to be a very well-known professor at Brown who became an expert on ancient Indian mathematics. His name is David Pingree. And Pingree's, and there are scholars in India too who have written similar things. You can see, approximation of pi, where they talk of elephants and camels and this and that. It's very, very different ways of thinking about these things than how we have thought about it. It's very natural ways of thinking about things. Deep connections between mathematics and nature expressed through language.
Over there, and then the gentleman there. Yes.
Hello. Yeah. So, sir, being a computer scientist, do you plan to use natural language processing or help the research of natural language processing through your translations?
No. In the sense that, okay, let me simplify it this way. The translations as they're done today are extremely difficult, high quality, scholarly translations. So one of our translators, his name is Christopher Shackle. He's one of, very well-known scholar of Punjabi and perhaps even Persian, I think. He's based in London. He has studied this language for 50 years, or these languages for over 50 years. And he's a very deep scholar. I don't know of any computer science technique that will come anywhere close as of today to Christopher Shackle's mind. So I would hesitate to say that, I would hesitate to be a tech bro and say, yeah, tech will do it.
No, sir. I actually meant to say that using these translations, we will help the research for natural language processing, and using the efficiency that these translators provide, we can make the machine learning more advanced.
Maybe. I don't know. I have to think about it. I hesitate to say yes. As soon as somebody says machine learning today, it's a catch-all phrase for everything. So, but I understand the vector of your thought.
Yeah.
It's just I've not thought about it that way. So, at least not yet.
I guess my question was actually similar insofar as, in what you've spoken about, one of the big constraints for you is the ability to translate. The fact that experts may not be around later, the fact that you have a lot of other things to translate. So what are you thinking about with regards to preserving or expanding that ability to translate? And one of those might relate to
Right.
forward, but just curious about that.
No, I think that's a very good question. The truth is today our entire bandwidth is on just making these translations happen with whatever we have. But there is a problem that we will run into for sure in the next 30 or 40 years, which is, do we still have access to enough translators for the various languages? In my opinion, yeah, maybe technology is one way, but I still think tech has a long way to understand a lot of the complexities. We have, if the root issue is what? The root issue is not enough people are studying these things. not enough people will take up these things as a career. There's no career or job prospect. So trying to solve some of these root issues, creating maybe positions in universities, paying very well, maybe creating graduate student fellowships and so on. That's the only way that I can think of right now of trying to extend this a little bit further. But beyond that, it's not clear. Because if you look at, I mean, this is, by the way, it's not just a trend for Indian language, it's a trend even for Greek and Latin. Except by sheer volume, you still have more Greek and Latin scholars today, but they don't get jobs. And I think it's less true for the Indian scholars, or for scholars of Indian languages.
Last one. Yeah, last question. Yeah. This is Abhijit from the Times of India's Bengali Daily. I think you mentioned in one of your interviews that your next project will be on women artists. Could you throw some light on that?
Yeah, I have a couple of different projects, but that's again in the ground floor, so I don't want to say too much. In a very brief nutshell, it was motivated really by a friend of mine who just finished her PhD at Princeton, and she's collected some fantastic data showing statistically why have women artists been systematically undervalued, and how they have been, not why, I think how they have been undervalued. And so she and I were brainstorming, and then we said, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we created a small collection of art by women artists who are not known, but maybe in 30 years from now people will say, oh, this was the definitive thing, and we'll open source the whole thing so people can come and study them and write about them and so on. And we'll showcase, or we want to create something that will become a good showcase for women's art, or women artists' work, I should say. But it's still very preliminary, so there's not much to say.
All right, thanks everybody. Thanks very much.
Well, I guess we're just glad that Mr. Murthy has taken up the mantle upon himself to rescue this 10 million books, which in my opinion are an endangered genre of books. Therefore, I guess Mr. Murthy here is doing a commendable job. Therefore, a huge round of applause for him. With that, we come to the end of this session. Mr. Arunava Sinha would be available for signing his books. There may be. Our next session begins in the next 10 minutes.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes, definitely.
So all our books are available on Amazon and Flipkart.
Yes.
I don't find them in bookstores as much. I don't know why. I should find out why. But please do, again, we don't make any buck off of this. Please do buy them, celebrate them. For Diwali's, gift books, not crackers, right? And my friend Nandini does that actively. And every January you'll find 4 new volumes that are released. And by the way, these books are like 300 rupees each. So there's really no excuse for not really getting these books, right? So please, we need your help in keeping these things alive, right? So thank you.
Sorry for interrupting, but maybe we should, introspect more about what Mr. Murthy here said. That is, in India, you do not invent history, you read history. Therefore, let's continue with the reading.